I am Mike Truex, and this is the 119th anniversary of the World's Fair, and it's also the 37th anniversary of the Society. Emily told you that the World's Fair Museum has been taken down. It'll reopen next year in about 10 months or so, and I can't wait to see it. Today you'll see a presentation about the World's Fair from a different perspective, mainly looking at the events before the fair opened and what happened after the fair closed. I usually ask at a meeting like this if there are any new members or non-members here tonight. So if you're not a member of the Society, please raise your hand. Wow, there's a lot of people from the History Museum that the advertising caught, just at a guess, 40, 50, 60 people. If you're a member of the Society, raise your hand. That's pretty good. So you people who aren't members, make sure to get some handouts and read that over. They tell about the World's Fair and about the Ferris wheel, and you'll learn more about that as we go through this presentation. And if you're interested in joining, you can contact one of the members or read that handout. Please be sure and silence your cell phones so that they don't go off in the middle of the presentation. And for members who know about our meetings and stuff, be sure and visit the Society website regularly. The new upgraded website has been released with information about our upcoming meetings. You can purchase Society merchandise and pay online. It also has pictures of past meetings and past bulletins. Also, for everyone, how many people know about the Society's Facebook group? Only a few people. Well, even if you're not in Facebook, I think you can go look at it. The 1904 World's Fair Society and Appreciation Group has nearly 6,000 members, and there's always postings about World's Fair events, memorabilia, buildings, etc. And I've learned a few things from many of those 6,000 people, even after researching the fair for 25 years. And on YouTube, this is being recorded, and we'll eventually get this presentation on YouTube. There's over 15 Society meetings over the last 2 years that we've recorded, and you can go and see some of the past meetings. A quick update about next month, some upcoming meetings. On Thursday, August 17th at 6 p.m. in Buder Library, and this information, of course, is also on our website and in our bulletin. Karen Gehring from the Missouri History Museum will give a presentation about this very building. Well, maybe not this new part, but the old part of the building, and you'll see a little bit of that at the end of this presentation. She'll tell us about the history of the building, how the Historical Society began and moved into this building. She's the Managing Director of Administration and Operations for the Missouri History Museum. On Saturday, September 2nd, the Society will have a special members' opportunity to take a guided tour of Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum. We will have tours at 10 and 1:30. The tours will require a reservation and a $15 payment to cover the expenses and make a donation. Our master guide and former treasurer, Dan Fuller, will take us on a trolley bus tour of the park to see the final resting places of many of the people who helped organize and run the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Our September meeting, we will have a meeting on Sunday, not meeting, but an event on Sunday, September 25th at Francis Park, and we're going to man a tent like we did last year at the event, the art show they have there called Art in the Park. And I know there's a few members here who participated in that. If you did Art in the Park last year, raise your hand. There's a few people here and there. We saw hundreds and hundreds of people and sold merchandise and just had a lot of fun time there. So now I'd like to set the stage for this presentation by taking you back 119 years ago. It was Monday, July 18th, 1904. The fair had been open for 6 weeks, and the buildings, the exhibit palaces, and pike concessions were all completed and open. With the coming of summer, the eager crowds were getting larger and larger. It was Forestry Day, and 1,000 members of the United Order of Foresters met in the Temple of Fraternity for 3 days. That building would host dozens of conventions and congresses, and bringing in thousands of people to come see the World's Fair. The big electrical convention began with 800 or 900 people. They highlighted the new marvels that were exhibited all over the fair, including wireless telegraphy, massive generators and dynamos, electric ovens, X-ray equipment, and a method to distribute electric power all over the fairgrounds with over 1 million light bulbs. 2 companies were exhibiting biographs. Anybody know what a biograph is? A biograph is an early motion picture, and you could go into a theater and see moving pictures in front of you, and that amazed the audiences. The New Hampshire building opened. It was a replica of the birthplace of Daniel Webster. It was a plain 2-story building and displayed many artifacts from that famous statesman. Newspapers reported that several new Olympic competitions would be held starting next month. The first ever Olympic Roquet tournament would be held at the Olympic Stadium in August. Also, Olympic cricket championships would be held in September. Entries were already being received, and an Olympic archery competition would be held in September. And I bet you there's at least 1 or 2 society members who know that was the only Olympic sport that was open to women, archery. And as the temperature soared to 90 degrees and higher, the Exposition Management Company banned city ice wagons from coming onto the fairgrounds. The Exposition wanted to make money, and they in fact did make a profit, as you'll see. But though several states had already prepaid for ice from outside companies, they said that the Exposition Company would sell ice to them and other concessions, but they would charge a fee about 25% higher than the normal fee. Yes, they did make money. So now it's time for our presentation. For those who are on Zoom, I hope we have some people on Zoom. If you have any questions for me, please enter them into the Zoom comments portal. And Doug is monitoring that, and he'll get those to us later. So let's get on with the presentation after I introduce myself. I came to St. Louis in 1989, near the end of my active duty Air Force career. I soon found out about the World's Fair, and I also found out about the same time that my great-grandmother had attended it, and I have a little piece of Ruby Flash, a toothpick holder, with my great-grandmother's name on it. I joined the society, and I got so interested that I began to research the greatest World's Fair, and that effort continues today. As Emily said, I enjoy researching the amazing facts and spreading the word about the fair. So here's my product of my most recent research. As the 20th century began, America was undergoing a major and rapid transformation. The largely rural America was becoming an industrialized society with large cities and manufacturing centers. With these changes came an increase in the time that Americans had for entertainment. In the late 1800s, the large eastern cities had movies, museums, and big entertainment parks like Coney Island. But in the rest of America, entertainment also often traveled to the audience. Circuses, large and small, traveled the country by train, setting up in fields near towns for a few days of performances. Buffalo Bill and Frederick T. Cummins put on Wild West shows across America, and they even went to Europe to celebrate and remember the vanishing frontier of America's West. But another type of entertainment also captured America's attention. The Victorian-era World's Fairs displayed the products, culture, and art from countries around the world, and even put foreign people on exhibit. This picture is the cover of a dedication program from 1903, which was attended by President Roosevelt and former President Grover Cleveland. So, how many World's Fairs did they have? This is a partial list of some of the bigger World's Fairs from 1851 up to 1915. They took place mainly in Europe and America. They all had large and fanciful buildings. They marketed new farming products, displayed modern inventions, and they sold manufacturers' goods to the world. They provided a vast array of entertainment to millions of fair visitors. And you can see that the U.S.'s first big one was the 1876 Centennial. Chicago got on board with the 1893 Columbian Exposition. And of course, St. Louis, 11 years later, wanted to outdo that, and they put on the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. And there were other ones held out in the West Coast and Norfolk that celebrated the Jamestown settlement. A lot of World's Fairs took place in that era, but none were as big in acreage or what was displayed as St. Louis. The president of the 1904 World's Fair was David R. Francis, the former mayor of St. Louis, governor of Missouri, and secretary of the Interior. He worked tirelessly for many years to bring a World's Fair to St. Louis. In fact, he started before he became governor, trying to get the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian, but that was awarded to Chicago. And the only award process was getting some federal money to kind of get you going. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So they missed out on the 1893 fair. As Secretary of the Interior, he established a lot of connections in Washington. And starting in 1898, 1899, he began planning for the 1903 World's Fair. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Thank you very much. Give me just a minute to get over to Zoom here. Okay, that's not it. Okay, let's try this. Let's get into Zoom. PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So let me now get back to PowerPoint and full screen. Hopefully that works for the people that are online to see the presentation. And where's my view? Okay, I can work it this way, I guess, just as well. Okay, David Roland Francis managed to obtain funding, and a statue of him is actually been put up in Forest Park, Francis Park, thank you, in 2018 on land that he donated to the city on Christmas Eve while he was in Russia. So why do we have World's Fairs? We talked about that. We're going to go into construction challenges and the fair, demolition, and what happened after the fair. There were a lot of things that began being proposed as we started getting the money organized, and I'll show you the money in just a second. But as the ideas were being generated and the funding started getting acquired and secured, we wanted to have something like Chicago had, but we wanted to do it bigger and better. Chicago had a bunch of big buildings around the edge of Lake Michigan with canals, etc. So the Louisiana Purchase Exposition wanted $15 million in capital to start work. They did get $5 million pretty quickly from the sale of private stock. They also got $5 million from the state of Missouri. And they finally acquired, in the middle of 1901, a $5 million loan from the federal government. And with that, they started selection and site planning. They found two things out pretty quickly. Number one, they were going to need some more money to get the building going in 1903. And also, by the time about a year had gone by, they were spending money left and right to get the buildings built. And in mid-1902, number one, they wanted to get all the buildings done. And number two, they wanted a lot of participation from Europe. And given only a year, Europe kind of balked a little bit, to try to build a big building or something in less than a year. So they delayed it to 1904 for European participation. But plans started coming in right away, and quite early, in fact. John Anderson proposed a big, tall tower. Guess what, 1,000 feet higher. It was a three-legged tower, and doesn't that look like something in Paris? He suggested putting that right in the middle of kind of a triangle-shaped World's Fair that would have a three-pronged lake sticking out from it, and a train, a railway system that would go around the fair, and you can kind of see the dotted line and black line going around, and it would go through the buildings. So St. Louis had their money and they started looking at locations to have it. And there's some of the locations that they considered. There was really only one choice, but St. Louis in 1904, you can see, was concentrated pretty much to the east of Forest Park and north and south of the river. And though they looked at Creve Coeur Lake, that was too far out for transportation, but it was a great place to hold the rowing events. O'Fallon Park down here at the bottom of this was a possibility. It was a large park, and if you acquired some land, you could get to the river because they wanted to have some river frontage. Down here at the bottom of this is where Fairground Park is, and they wanted to get land to go all the way down to the river. Well, that was one possibility. There was some unused land northwest out along what is today I-70 between Kings Highway and Goodfellow, and it was just not near the river and not well considered. Down in Carondelet, which had been acquired by the city in the late 1800s, annexed by the city, there was a large park down there, and it had a bluff going up to the river, and you could also go on lower land near the bluff to get down to the riverfront. And that was a proposal that did get evaluated, but not as much. There was also a bunch of land that David R. Francis owned in southwest St. Louis City, between Kings Highway going out towards Chippewa on the edge of the city. And as I said, he did donate Francis Park to the city, but that wasn't enough acreage, and access to it was not as good. So an organization called the Forest Park World's Fair Free Site Association Early Layout.
Your slides aren't showing on the display. They're showing here, but they're not showing on
The screen share is not working? Well, if we're getting a good recording, why don't you tell the people, hopefully there's not too many of them, to listen and see what they can see. Let's see, let me stop the share. I'll try one other thing here. Looks like we got 9 or 10 people. Share screen. PowerPoint slideshow. Share. Hopefully that's a little better, Doug. I appreciate the information.
Charles Taylor says that's working.
Okay, good. A little reset there. So this World's Fair Free Site Association was formed to say Forest Park is the place to have it. Now this is a map of Forest Park at the time with a drawing of where the World's Fair could be. It's got south at the top, from Kings Highway on the left out to Skinker on the right. And they came up with an L-shaped layout in the undeveloped part of the park because the city had said you cannot use the eastern part of the park because that's developed. That is St. Louis's playground. But you could use the western part. And if we look at that, you can see there's big palaces and city buildings, and there's higher elevation here in the middle, which today we know is Art Hill. And eventually that was chosen without a whole lot of discussion because there was train access to that. They could get the construction material out there. And here's an early plan of Forest Park with our, as it was called, a fan-shaped building. This is a better drawing of that. And if you look at the top of Art Hill here, this big curved thing says art. This is where the Art Palace was going to be, in this big curved building. And we know that didn't happen, that the Art Museum ended up being put back behind there, and Festival Hall got put in front of it. And they began to name the buildings, and they were awarding contracts to build these big buildings, the smallest of which was the size of 4 Macy's, about 9 acres. And after a while, as they started looking at more and more exhibits, they realized we need to move machinery over here, and we'll call this Varied Industries, and they renamed them all. So sometimes you'll see pictures of a building with the wrong name on it, like textiles. There was no textiles building for the fair that was built. So we've looked at this a little bit, and I've already kind of told you where was the fair located exactly from looking at it. Well, here's Forest Park where we are today, on the northern edge of Forest Park. And if you say the fair was held in Forest Park, with the History Museum right here at Lindell and de Bolivar going up to the north. The major street names are in blue and the landmarks are indicated in black. So let's go back and look at the World's Fair. And there's all the same landmarks aligned in the map that has been cropped to have north at the top instead of south at the top. So let's put these two maps together and put the World's Fair over that. And you can see that the World's Fair basically started at Hampton, where the main entrance by the zoo is, and went out past Skinker, and then went all the way out to Big Bend. And they rented some land. They rented Washington University, which was beginning to build their new campus. They rented all this land in green for more exhibit palaces and the Philippine exhibit. And they finally, in late 1903, got this tract of land on the north side of Lindell rented, because that's where they had really wanted to put the Pike. And that's what they ended up doing. And as a result, probably about a third or more of the Pike attractions were not open on opening day. There were construction challenges to meet. Here's an engineering map of the World's Fair that shows the low and high pressure water lines, the sewer lines, and interestingly it has on, hopefully, can you see the mouse at all? No. This is one of the more interesting things that you hear about today even. The River des Peres comes in the bottom down here and follows this kind of gray-shaped path that comes up in this area and ends up wandering around at the base of Art Hill and goes all the way up around here into a lake before it exits the fair over here. Well, they wanted to build all these buildings on top of that swamp. There were some trees over here and they had to take these trees down. So starting here in this red line, they buried the River des Peres right along these lagoons in 3 wooden conduits that were, I think, 12 by 12, and finally exited at the right place. They filled in part of this lake, and part of liberal arts was built on pilings where that lake had been. So imagine overcoming that. So here's a map that shows that same thing that I described on the current map of the fair. The blue dotted line shows where in 1903, 02 and 03 they buried the River des Peres. And then the red line shows where the River des Peres is now buried today. So there's where they buried the River des Peres into the 3 wooden channels. And this is a great view from the Post-Dispatch. There's the History Museum right here. Here's Lindell. Here's Forest Park. This shows a pile of dirt where they dug out to put the concrete channels in that go right along Lindell. And Emily, I don't know if you've ever heard the River des Peres. I've heard from people that after a thunderstorm, if you go out around the fountain, you can hear the water rushing underneath. And it goes all the way along Lindell before Union. It kind of cuts off to the south and goes all the way into the park and goes out and eventually goes underneath the high school and the science center and comes out just east of Macklin. And if you take the Macklin overpass, when you get down to the lowest part where you're over the trench and you look to the east, you can see where the River des Peres exits. That was a massive, bond that was issued to millions of dollars reconstruct the River des Peres, because although they thought they had it buried, in 1915, what was left of a hurricane, a tropical depression, came up and sat over St. Louis for 2 days and dumped about 20 inches of rain. I didn't include it, but there's a picture of the History Museum surrounded by probably 2 feet of water. I don't know if it got up to the floor or not, but they said, well, we can't have that anymore. We've got to do something. This is what they did to solve the River des Peres. And they also included the part where further down, where along 44, where it merges with Deer Creek, and they made that big trench to straighten out the River des Peres all the way to the Mississippi. and it got its nickname the River Depew. They also put it in the tunnels that go all the way up into University City, and there was an article in the newspaper just a couple days ago about how those tunnels have become partially clogged with debris and rocks and trees and stuff like that. So that's still an issue. They've got to get into that tunnel and clean it out so that it flows a lot better. So, moving on to the fun stuff, the construction. They had the money, they had the plans, and they wanted to start building. So in late 1901, they drove the first stake, which is a point up behind the art museum. And if you remember that fan-shaped thing that had all those lines coming together, that's where the first stake was. That was ground zero for measuring where the palaces would be and Art Hill and stuff like that. So then a few months later, they had groundbreaking on December 20th, 1901. The newspapers reported it was in the single digits at best. They had to light a fire to soften up the ground so that they could shovel the dirt. And everybody is wearing their heaviest coats and gloves and stuff like that. But they did have that groundbreaking ceremony, with appropriate dignitaries. And then they started laying out where the buildings were going to go, and they started construction. They laid a foundation, and they started raising a core for the walls with lattice work. And this picture is undated, but this was probably early '02. And not too much later, what you see there would turn into this, and walls would be constructed with scaffolding on the outside. And on a view just a little bit later, probably in '02, here's the wall from the outside. You can see ladders going up the side. And I think that thing on the left was basically a movable construction piece that they could shift left and right to get people where they needed to go so that they could put the staff on the outside of the building. The fair was open on Sundays, and for 25 cents you could go see what was going on, and this little boy's family probably took him and they brought him a snack. And he's not too impressed with what's behind him. He's got some Cracker Jacks or something like that. So here's a picture of several palaces under construction. And anybody got any guesses as to what this big, wide highway is? Three 12-foot channels made out of wood put together, covered with dirt. That's the River Depew. Buried under that big wide walkway. And there's a couple palaces that look like they're moving along. This was taken from the top of Liberal Arts, which was moving along, where they had Dedication Day. That's the Palace of Buried Industries back there. And this palace, Manufactures, is just kind of getting going. The walls are going up. Just to show you a little bit more detail. I've got a lot of these pictures that I will be able to zoom in on a little bit. So let's take a look at Festival Hall under construction. This is a picture before they really got going, but the colonnade and the two pavilions were built on the top of Art Hill. And the cascades in front. Something I learned about 2 years ago, these cascades and all the bases for the statues and all the pools that the water would flow down in were not at ground level. They were all elevated 8 to 10 to 12 feet, and there's basically a cave underneath them so that they could supply pipes to the various fountains and stuff like that. Just an effort that amazed me when I found out about that. So here's Festival Hall under construction, which was in front of the Art Museum in late 1903, November. The fair would open in about 6 months. I don't see any bucket lifts or, whatever. They've got the cascades in place. This is where the first big waterfall is going to be, and the dome kind of is starting to go up here. And think about getting all those pieces of staff up there and putting them together, etc. From the back side, here's a Festival Hall under construction with about the same time, which is moving along a little bit better. The organ would be put in here, administrative offices, and the stage area behind inside of Festival Hall. Here's a side view of Festival Hall. I want you to remember this one. I'll mention it a little bit later with the dome up but not decorated. We'll see a picture of it a little bit later on from this angle. Going back to the rear view, see the fanciful decoration up there and stuff? Look at all these staff sculptures that are put around here. They haven't even put the statue on top yet. Can anybody see a couple of workers having their lunch break? February 1904, the end of February. The fair is going to open in 2 months. But they made it, and there's Festival Hall with the statue on top and the cascades in front and water rushing down. And another colorized picture just to put it in perspective. In this picture, you can just barely see a small tiny bit of the art museum right there, that angled rooftop there. Just to show you, when you're in front of the art museum by the statue, this thing was twice as tall as the art museum. And the cascades had to be just totally impressive. The big waterfall at the top, the sprays from the fountains, etc. And not only was there a cave under there for the piping, underneath one of the smaller side cascades is where the 3 big pumps were to pump the water to go up to the top of Art Hill to dump out 40 or 50,000 gallons per minute. We'll look at one of the big buildings that was constructed, the U.S. government building, which was a little bit different from the others. Instead of a wooden framework to start with, the U.S. government started with a steel-beamed arch construction that took a while to put up, but the government, U.S. government, federal government paid for that. It housed a lot of government exhibits and Smithsonian exhibits. Think of all that wood. Oh, look, they're starting to get the staff on the columns. And there's what it looked like when it was finished. So let's take just a few minutes and look at some views of the fair. Starting back in late '03 and early '04, different people started doing illustrations and drawings of the fair. This is one by Ferris, who drew a lot of similar type drawings of European cities, Paris, London, etc. And he had most of the palaces in the right place. He had the Pike in the right place and most of the Pike exhibits and stuff. This was a late 1903 drawing that was colored and used as a publicity piece, and it was sent out to cities all over the country and even in Europe, I think. The History Museum made a poster of these, I think in the 80s for the 1986 exhibit, and they sold those up through about 2000 or so. So you find a lot of these in St. Louis today. It's a very impressive drawing. But this little structure at the right bottom entrance was not built. It doesn't show the Pike, it doesn't show the Ferris wheel, and a few other things, because this was done before all those decisions got made. Here's an aerial view of Forest Park today. You can see the Grand Basin and the Art Museum on top of Art Hill. There's the Grand Basin. There's the Art Museum. Here's the History Museum, right here. Here's Lindell. Here's Skinker, looking to the southwest. Because back in 1904, or back in 1950, St. Louis commissioned Norbury Wayman to make a drawing of the fair, and he used the map and a lot of photographs to draw a aerial view layout of the fair. So there's Art Hill and Festival Hall, the Grand Basin. Of course, the History Museum is down here at the main entrance, and your 8 big palaces right here going up Government Hill, the Missouri building on top of the hill, all the foreign buildings out there to the upper left. And as we slide out to the right, you can see the Ferris wheel and Skinker going up and down, and all the way out to Washington University and the gymnasiums out here at the end. Palace of Agriculture was over 20 acres. That's one of my favorite words to hear is wow. So some amazing views of the fair. Here's a panorama, and unfortunately I'm not going to switch to different applications with being able to share it and stuff like that. But this is a panorama made from the wireless telegraph tower, almost 300 feet tall. About 5 different pictures were put together and photoshopped. And there's a picture looking down at the Palace of Liberal Arts, and then over to the right, manufacturers. Up here you can see Festival Hall, and I'm going to try going backwards. Come on. Okay, you can see Festival Hall here, and the Art Museum is behind it. And again, looking down at one of the large palaces, that little thing that's straight up, any idea what that is? That's the Ferris wheel. It's a sideways view of the Ferris wheel from over a mile away. This is one of my favorite views. Everyone knows where Government Hill is with the World's Fair Pavilion at the top and the fountain halfway down. And the U.S. Government Building was halfway up there. From the front steps of the U.S. Government Building, about where that fountain is today, if you look down at Government Drive, which goes across the bottom here where people park to get to the zoo, this is the view you would have. And the reason I like this so much is that look at the size of the people here compared to the base of the statue, compared to the statue, compared to the roof line, and look at all the statues they put on top. How did they do all of that in 1904, 1903? Festival Hall again, just to enjoy the view. And the night view. Festival Hall and the colonnade and the pavilions had 3 strings of lights, amber, red, and green. And they had the technology developed that they could dim them, they were incandescent lights, and then change them. And they would change from the white, and the white would begin to dim and the red would come in. And before you know it, you're looking at everything kind of glowing red. And then it would switch over to green. It's a very impressive effect when it's done right. And it's well described in some of the diaries and stuff from the fair. So here's a view, kind of a then and now, looking down Lindell from the front of the Washington University Administration Building, now known as Brookings Hall. It was completed in 1904, and this was looking down, and in the distance to the right, you can see construction going on in the upper right. Well, here's what that view would look like a couple of years later when the fair was completed. Palace of Transportation on the right with Belgium closer. And on the left, I think that's New York to the North Pole and the beginning of the Pike. Okay, so the Ferris wheel had been built for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 by George Washington Gale Ferris. It was taken apart and moved to North Chicago for about a year or so of operation. And in fact, he put an amusement park around it, and it ran until I think about 1901. Unfortunately, not long after the Chicago World's Fair, George Washington Gale Ferris got divorced, he died, and the company went bankrupt because there wasn't enough people coming to see the Ferris wheel and stuff to, justify its operation. So with the company in bankruptcy, they kept operating for a couple of years, going deeper and deeper into debt. And to settle their debts, they basically demolished the whole Ferris wheel park, and the Ferris wheel went up for sale. The Chicago House Wrecking Company, and I'll get to them, said, there's a whole lot of steel in there, and we're a salvage company. They bought the Ferris wheel that had cost, I think, some $700,000 for $8,150. Problem was they had to take it apart or blow it up or whatever. Well, about that time, St. Louis was getting their World's Fair organized, and I think they contacted each other, and St. Louis wanted to have a big signature piece, and they said, we'd love to get that Ferris wheel, what's it gonna cost us? And they negotiated, came on a financial settlement of sorts that we still haven't gotten the details on. But they figured out how to take the Ferris wheel apart again. It hadn't been moved for, 8 or 9 years, well, 9 or 10 years. How to take it apart, and they put the 70-ton axle on 2 railroad cars. They put the rest of the 100,000 parts on about 175 train cars and brought it down to St. Louis in late 1903. In early 1904, they started building the foundations and the towers. Once they got the towers and all the pieces down here, and the support towers are the angled towers, and all that vertical wood is, and the cranes on the top are what it took to lift pieces of metal up to where construction workers could put it together. I think they had a crew of close to 100 people that were rebuilding the Ferris wheel. So here's March 1904. The fair is going to open in about a month. So now they've got the axle on there, April 6th. The fair is going to open in 3 or 4 weeks. And they're starting to get the curved parts of the wheel together. And can you see the workers? Normally, in a presentation like this, I can switch applications very quickly and really zoom in, and you can see that those construction workers all have hats on. They don't have any safety belts. Okay, can you guess where the construction workers are on this one, which is 2 days before opening day? Okay, can you see the construction workers now? Okay, so now about a week later, look at that. They've got the inner circle done, the outer circle. There's 1 car on the Ferris wheel down here. And I bet you can see a couple of people now that I've asked that question. That guy is probably 220 feet up in the air. And you can't quite see it, but he does have his hat on. So there's the observation wheel about 3 weeks later, all completed, all the cars are on it, been tested and adjusted, and they're open for business on April 28th. And as we zoom in here, you can actually, I think, see that there's people in the cars. All the men probably have hats on too. And the windows could be open, but they had bars in front of them that probably don't show up in this picture. And now we're going to take a ride on the Ferris wheel. How many people have gone on a Ferris wheel down at downtown? Well, that Ferris wheel is only 200 feet. This was 250 feet. But Mark Eisenberg, would you stand up on the corner? Is that you right there, Mark? Would you stand up for a second? If you go from Mark to the railing and back behind him and all the way down that row, and sir, you with the tan hat, would you stand up also? Yes, you. Would you raise your hand or stand up? You two would be on corners of the Ferris wheel in a car, and the car would go all the way back to that main aisle. 1 Ferris wheel car, 16 by 26. Thank you. I always enjoy asking some people to, show how big the Ferris wheel car is. It could carry 60 people, but I don't think they ever put more than about 30 people in the car at a time, even on opening day. But look at that big axle, 45 feet long, 32 inches in diameter. Here we are going up a little bit higher. Look at all those rods and cables, part of the 100,000 pieces they had to get together the right way. So now we're up near the top and we're looking south on Skinker. You can see the Palace of Agriculture, the intramural railway. Looking up towards Washington University, you can easily see Brookings Hall, the administration building, some of the foreign buildings. Up here in the distance, there's U-City City Hall. Looking a little bit further to the right, you could see the Pike and the Palace of Transportation, New York to the North Pole. And right along here is where that famous picture of the family eating the ice cream cone was taken. Now looking over towards the main picture, you can see Festival Hall, the Art Museum, Jerusalem, the Mosque of Omar, the Japanese, or yeah, Japan's village there. I'm sorry, China's exhibit. And I'm not going to go into the fair too much because, yeah, I'm about on time here. Good. I also wanted to talk about demolition. So the Chicago House Wrecking Company had salvaged several other World's Fairs. They knew how to take buildings apart. They had been out here since the beginning of the construction of the St. Louis World's Fair because they wanted to win this contract. They knew that there would be a lot to salvage. They had supplied and operated the Ferris wheel. And once they got past a certain amount of money, I think they did share, as did all concessions, about 25% of their gross revenue was basically taxed by the World's Fair. That's how they made money, just like the ice. There was a contentious bidding because there were several bids that were submitted, and some of the pieces were already spoken for. For example, the intramural train cars were going to be sold under a separate contract. All the foreign buildings and state buildings were owned by the countries or states. Many of them were sold separately. In fact, some of the smaller state buildings were sold and relocated to various places in St. Louis. The huge Brazil building that I pointed out once or twice was steel framework, stone construction, taken apart, taken back down to Rio de Janeiro, and it became their Senate building for the next 25 or 30 years. So they paid, the wrecking company paid $450,000 to the World's Fair Company to salvage the palaces and many buildings. The LPE company just didn't want to get into that much of a mess. They didn't have the manpower to do it. The Chicago House Wrecking Company had the experience. They built up a staff of 2,000 people with their process. They had 2 fire departments in 1905. And as soon as a building was emptied, it was turned over to them for salvage. They got going, taking it apart from the top down. They had tunnels to send the staff down, to send the wood down on. And a lot of that salvage was shipped directly to purchasers and not stored. Some of it was cash or carry. If man building houses brought a big horse cart out and wanted to get a lot of wood to build houses and stuff, load it up and come to a price. Of course, after the fair closed and before demolition really got going, there was a snowstorm, I think, the winter of 04-05, and people started sledding down Art Hill. On some other pictures, you can tell that they're sliding down Art Hill on folding chairs that probably came out of Festival Hall. Wooden folding chairs, that is. So there's a picture of Art Hill. And look at that sad picture of Festival Hall. I told you to remember that picture from before when, the side view. There's a side view. And look there in the distance, there's a Ferris wheel on the left. There's a Palace of Transportation, probably about halfway down, with a yard full of rough lumber. So what did they do with all that lumber? Another view of transportation coming down. There are several of these pictures either on the Missouri Historical Society website or the St. Louis Public Library, where most of these pictures came from, and there are lots more of them. Down comes another palace. I think this is the Palace of Machinery. And they even took apart the bridges. And the Pike. Well, the Pike owners owned their own building, and they were responsible to take them down, but there was another World's Fair over in Portland in 1905, the Lewis and Clark Exposition. Some of them just walked away from it, and after a certain amount of time, if they weren't going to take it down, guess who took it down? The Chicago House Wrecking Company. More salvage for them. Here's the plaza with the Tyrolean Alps in the background you can see, and if you look up close here, there's a nice white horse with a fire wagon behind it. And looking down from Art Hill, there's a tower of the Palace of Electricity here on the left, and the Louisiana Purchase Monument in the distance. No palaces over here. They've already been taken down, I guess. So the Chicago House Wrecking Company, having salvaged World's Fairs before, they estimated that they salvaged 100 million board feet of lumber. They filled up 10,000 railroad cars full of staff. Most of it went to landfill, although I think a couple hundred railroad cars were recycled to make plaster again. I'm not sure how successful that was. They pulled nails out of the lumber and filled up barrels of nails and filled up 20 railroad cars full of barrels of used nails. 3 million pounds of copper wire, some of it on the original spools, unused. 2 million square feet of windows, light bulbs, about 1 million, boilers, furnaces, and dynamos, and here's their catalog about the thickness of a National Geographic. The $50 million fair up for salvage. And it lists, the Ferris wheel, of course, was maybe up for salvage. Fence, railroad track, iron pipe, office furniture, and a laundry list of miscellaneous stuff that came from the buildings. What a sale that was in 1905. But it eventually got down, where there wasn't much left of the walls or palaces or anything. And when I came across this picture on the State Historical Society, I'd never seen it before. This shows the Ferris wheel with no cars on it. The cars went early when they decided to salvage it and blow it up or move it. You know, there were no buyers to take it, so they weren't going to move it. And they were going to salvage it. But this picture of the lonely Ferris wheel, I just really love. And does this zoom a little? Oh yeah, this zooms. How many people can see the art museum? Way over here on top of Art Hill, and you can see that that's the hill. This is along Skinker. This is the end of only one wall and a tower of the Palace of Machinery. There may be a car on it down here, and that's the life-saving building at the edge of Life-Saving Lake, looking to the southeast. So the disposition of the Ferris wheel, I think this photo was taken from the top of the hill where the Palace of Forestry, Fish and Game was. And without all the buildings, you can see the topography and the hills of the fairgrounds. And the nearly restored Forest Park, they removed all the rubble and stuff. They planted grass, replanted some trees, etc. And park restoration was nearly complete. And I'll take a minute or two to talk about some of the restoration agreements. They left most of the piping and the fire hydrants in. Some of the lagoons were left. The city said, they offered to build the city a picnic pavilion up on top of Government Hill. And so where the Missouri building was, they built the World's Fair Pavilion, and that's where it got its name. And the city and the original contract said, you have to take everything down and get rid of it and restore the park in 6 months. Really? It took 2.5 years to build. It took a good 1.5 to 2 years to take it all down and salvage it, but they did a pretty darn good job. So they still had that Ferris wheel sitting there, and they considered, can we leave it there, build a new amusement park? Because there were a lot of amusement parks in St. Louis. Local people out here in Washington University building said, nope, we don't want an amusement park out this way. The proclamation from St. Louis and the contract with the LPE said, you got to restore it. And in fact, the Ferris wheel was on the Forest Park side of Skinker, so it had to be removed. They tried to sell it and couldn't, so demolishing it and selling it for scrap was the only thing. The axle was considered to be worth about $1,300 in 1906 for salvage, which is over $30,000 today. So if you blew up a house that had a big steel I-beam made out of, let's say, silver, would you bury that silver just because it was really heavy to move? Probably not. There's what happened on May 11th, 1906 to the Ferris wheel. They blew up the supports and the Ferris wheel basically collapsed upon itself. And where's the axle? Well, beginning not long after the fair, I guess in the 30s, people started looking for it for a metal drive for World War II. And they said, well, they couldn't have moved it. It's too heavy to move it, right? They didn't have any way to move it. Well, it had been moved 3 times before, once by the Chicago Wrecking Company when they brought it down from Chicago to St. Louis. The train tracks were still in place in 1906. How do you think they got rid of all the rest of the rubble? And after demolition, the removal of the axle wasn't news. It didn't make the newspapers or anything. It was just more salvage material. And Steve Schmitz has researched the Ferris wheel for probably as long as I've researched the fair. Steve's over here. If you got any Ferris wheel questions, Steve, raise your hand real quick. He's the man to go to. He knows twice as much as I do about it. There are several reasons why the documentation from the Chicago House Wrecking Company, letters and reports and stuff, say it was taken back to Chicago and eventually cut up for scrap just before World War I. So all those hunts and searches, at least we are convinced 98, 99% that it's not here, folks. Some legacies of the fair. Okay, new. Yeah, how'd you like a glass of water, folks? A few months before the fair opened, that's what came out of the faucets, and it was considered pretty good water because it was taken from the water collection places up near the Chain of Rocks Bridge. It was healthy, it was clean and stuff, but it sure didn't look good, and I'm not sure how it tasted. Mark Twain's comment was made about many rivers, but he said it was too thick to drink and too thin to plow. But can you imagine if this colored water was used in the fountains and all the sprays in the lagoons? So the mayor, Rollo Wells of St. Louis, and the LPE guy had to find a better way to filter it. And John Wixford eventually came up with that, and World's Fair Society people have read an article in the Bulletin, about a year ago? That was written maybe a year and a half ago about John Wixford. He came up with the solution of using chemicals to force the dirt to settle. And it worked pretty well and is still in use today. Of course, another legacy. How many people in here have a souvenir from the World's Fair? Yeah, that's what I thought. Handed down from your family or picked up at an antique shop or an estate sale or something. There's thousands, millions of pieces of souvenirs out there, and I've got my fair share, I think. The birdcage is still around. It was built by the Smithsonian for the World's Fair. I think it cost them $40,000 or $50,000 to make. And in the contract that they signed with the city had the right of first refusal to purchase it. And so the city purchased it before the Smithsonian could take it apart and put it back. And it's still on the same foundation. But here's a neat picture. Back during the World's Fair, it had a dividing wall in it, and it had a tunnel that's kind of out of view here to the right. The dividing wall is over here on the right, and the tunnel that people would walk through is over here. And you'd walk through a tunnel and look out either side of the tunnel to see the big birds or the small birds. The Grand Basin is a nice legacy of the fair. Here's a then and now picture taken looking down in 1904, down one of the Cascades, and taken today after the restoration, looking at the balustrades and stairs and the bridge over there on the far right. The bridge is very similar to the 1904 bridges, and the height of the trees is probably pretty comparable to the height of the building. So just imagine all those trees being a building next time you're up on top of Art Hill. I mentioned about the World's Fair Pavilion, which was made with profits from the fair. And they had enough money left over to do a couple of other things. They also put up gates in front of the World's Fair Stadium that called it David Francis Stadium. Named it after him with some pocket change left over. And they also used $300,000 or $400,000 and built the Jefferson Memorial, which was the first memorial to our third president, Thomas Jefferson. And of course, it's been remodeled a few times, and next month we're going to learn about its remodeling, expansion, etc. And that's what this newer part of the building looks like. And of course, the biggest thing around here is the Palace of Art. So this is what the Palace of Art looked like in 1904. And I like to wax poetic on these last few slides about 1904, and all of a sudden, let's go about 110 years later. So did you catch all the differences? That the chimneys are gone, that the statue here was gone, the eagle's on the corner. These statues are still there over the entryway with the columns. Let's go back about 110 years and take one more look. Next time you're up there driving along, and just think that was built for the World's Fair. Built to be permanent, and it's in, I think, pretty good shape. One other thing that kind of is a legacy of the fair, standing proudly in front of it, is the statue of St. Louis. Built out of bronze. This one is built out of bronze on a marble base. How many people think this statue was at the World's Fair? Ah, good, good. The original statue was made out of staff, as were all 1,100 other statues. So there's a picture of the statue of Louis IX called the Apotheosis of St. Louis at the World's Fair, and it had a subgroup which was not replicated later on. City residents liked it so much, they wanted to make it permanent, and so the LPE company asked the sculptor to make it permanent. And I forget the exact numbers, but he wanted about this much money to do that. And they said, no, we're not going to pay you that much. We'll get someone else to make it for this much money. And I forgot the names off the top of my head, but you can easily look them up on Wikipedia even. So he made this statue, and Niehaus sued, and I think he won like a couple $1,000, and he got his name on the front of the statue too, as the original sculptor of it. But I like to tell everyone, keep the memories of the fair alive, that it's just one of the most amazing times in this city's history. And imagine you're sitting around Festival Hall after it gets dark, about 8:30 or 9 o'clock on a nice summer night, and watching those lights change colors and the reflection in the Grand Basin. And that's my presentation, folks.